Have you ever felt like your mind was wired differently? Like your thoughts moved in quiet spirals while the world rushed ahead in straight lines? If you've spent more time reflecting than reacting, more time observing than speaking, then what Carl Jung called the intuitive introvert might sound uncomfortably familiar. Jung wasn't casually throwing around personality types. He believed the intuitive introvert wasn't just a preference, it was a way of existing, a deep, often misunderstood way of moving through life that shaped how someone thought, felt, loved, and suffered, and in many ways still does. Today, we'll dig into what Jung actually meant when he spoke about this rare personality orientation. We're not talking about quirky social media definitions or watered-down personality tests. We're talking about the raw, honest framework Jung developed from studying real people who felt like outsiders in a world that often mistook their silence for emptiness. Because if you've ever felt unseen while being deeply perceptive or exhausted by shallow small talk yet hungry for meaning, there's a reason for that. And understanding Jung's view might just help you stop blaming yourself for it. So before we can really understand what Jung saw in the intuitive introvert, we need to understand who he was, and more importantly, what kind of lens he was looking through. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, born in 1875. He started off as a close collaborator with Sigmund Freud, but eventually broke away when their views on the human psyche began to clash. Freud leaned heavily into childhood trauma and repressed desires. Jung, on the other hand, was more interested in the inner architecture of the mind, archetypes, the collective unconscious, the patterns beneath our thoughts that seem to echo across cultures and time. He believed personality wasn't a fixed identity, but a living process, something shaped by both internal inclinations and external tension. And that brings us to how he started mapping out types, not to put people in boxes, but to give language to the things most of us feel, but don't quite know how to explain. The concept of the intuitive introvert wasn't a label Jung used to flatter anyone. He described it as one of the most difficult types to understand and to be, not because it was rare, though it was, but because the inner life of such a person often ran in direct contradiction to the way the world demanded people behave. In his own words, Jung said, "The introverted intuitive has the rare gift of seeing the things behind things, the meaning behind meaning. But this type also runs the risk of falling into a sea of internal images, unable to explain themselves to anyone else." That single quote frames everything we're about to explore. Let's break this down. What exactly did Jung mean by an intuitive introvert? He saw it as a person whose dominant function is intuition, but pointed inward. This isn't about gut feelings or vague vibes. Jungian intuition, especially introverted, is about perceiving patterns beneath the surface. It's an orientation toward abstract meaning, potential, and inner imagery. And when that's paired with an introverted attitude, it creates a personality that feels pulled inward by default, always turning things over in the mind, questioning what's real versus what's just noise. So what does that actually feel like? Imagine being in a room full of people talking, laughing, planning. Everyone seems present, but your attention drifts toward something unspoken, someone's mood, the tension between two people, the subtle contradiction in someone's words. You might not even consciously notice it at first, but hours later, you're thinking about it, wondering what it meant, what it says about the whole situation. That's introverted intuition at work. This type doesn't just absorb data, it seeks meaning in ambiguity. But because that meaning often comes as a gut-level impression, not a logical breakdown, it can be hard to put into words, especially right away. And that's where the disconnect begins. Jung believed the intuitive introvert often struggles to be understood, not because they're trying to be mysterious, but because their way of knowing doesn't always translate cleanly into linear explanation. They often see the end of the thread before they can trace it back. This can make them seem evasive or vague, when really they're just trying to find language for something they experienced internally first. If you've ever found yourself needing hours or even days to explain why something felt off to you, only for it to finally make sense in hindsight, you might relate to this. Jung would say you were led by introverted intuition. Let's talk about the feeling of being out of sync with the world around you. Not because you're trying to be different, but because how you process reality just doesn't align with the pace or priorities of the majority. Jung noted that intuitive introverts tend to feel like outsiders, not in a melodramatic sense, but in a quiet, ongoing way that's hard to explain. They often sense patterns others don't notice. They draw meaning from subtle impressions, tone shifts, glances, the silence between words. But when they try to share those insights, they're often met with confusion or indifference. Have you ever made a comment that felt important to you, something you thought others would connect with, and the room just moved on? Not hostile, not even dismissive, just like they didn't quite register what you were trying to say. That's a common experience for people wired this way, and over time, it teaches them to keep their inner world close. There's also a timing issue. By the time an intuitive introvert finally feels ready to explain what they've been sensing, everyone else has already moved on. That delay isn't because they're unsure, it's because their understanding is layered. It takes time to unpack something that arrived as a gut feeling, not a fact list. Now layer in cultural pressure. We live in a world that values speed, clarity, directness, decisiveness. Intuitive introverts often show up with the opposite: pause, ambiguity, reflection, and nuance. That creates friction, not because they're wrong, but because the system doesn't wait for depth. It rewards reaction over reflection. Jung described this as a kind of quiet suffering, not dramatic but cumulative, a slow sense of being misread, not seen clearly, even by people with good intentions. So what happens then? Some withdraw entirely. Others learn to perform a version of themselves that feels more acceptable, simpler, more upbeat, more certain. But either way, something internal gets edited out. If any of this sounds like you, you're not alone in it. And there's nothing broken about your wiring. You're just navigating a world built for a different tempo. Let's turn the lens a bit. All that internal tension, all that quiet dissonance, what happens when it's given space instead of being suppressed? This is where Jung saw the deeper potential of the intuitive introvert. He believed that when a person learns to trust their inner images, their hunches, their quiet truths, they stop waiting for external validation. They don't need the world to get them first. They start moving from something more stable, an internal compass that doesn't need applause. Think about the kind of creativity that doesn't come from chasing trends, but from sitting with ideas long enough to uncover something new, or the kind of decision-making that doesn't react, but waits for clarity. This isn't laziness or indecisiveness, it's depth. And when paired with self-awareness, it becomes a real kind of strength. One of Jung's ideas was that the intuitive introvert isn't meant to lead from the front. They influence quietly, sometimes invisibly, like undercurrents shaping a shoreline. Not everyone sees the impact right away. That's fine. The point isn't visibility, it's alignment. There's also a certain resilience here. While extroverted types often depend on outer conditions to stay steady, feedback, activity, recognition, introverted intuitives, once they're grounded, can draw from something deeper. Solitude becomes fuel, not punishment. Reflection becomes motion, not delay. But it takes time to reach that point, because the world won't hand you permission to live that way. You kind of have to take it, bit by bit, by saying no to things that flatten you, by learning when your silence is wisdom and when it's avoidance, by unlearning the pressure to constantly explain yourself. Ever had a moment where you did something completely in line with your inner sense, even when nobody understood it, and then months later, it all made sense, maybe even to others? That's not a fluke. That's how intuitive introversion works when it's trusted. So what happens when the way you naturally operate, slow, internal, layered, runs up against a world that rewards speed, clarity, and constant external proof? This is where many intuitive introverts find themselves quietly unraveling, not because they're weak, but because they're often miscast. The way they take in information doesn't always look productive on the surface. They might need days to process a decision that others want made in a 5-minute meeting. They might feel deeply about something but struggle to package it in neat, quick language. And in those moments, the pressure builds, not to be understood, but to translate constantly. Carl Jung referred to this as the struggle of individuation. Becoming who you are while existing in a world that keeps asking you to be someone else. The world isn't going to slow down for your process, but you also can't speed up your depth just to meet someone else's comfort zone. So the tension builds, and if you're not careful, you start living split. You play a role at work or in relationships, but go quiet afterward. You shut down parts of yourself because they feel inconvenient, and over time, you start forgetting which version is real. That's the danger. But here's the thing worth sitting with. You don't have to be everything to everyone. What you do need is a rhythm that honors your mind's natural way of moving, and a life structure that gives it room to function. That might look like setting boundaries around how much stimulation you allow in, or choosing work that favors depth over volume, or being honest with yourself when a relationship requires too much performance. It's okay to not be on all the time. You're not broken because you need quiet. You're not failing because your gifts don't look loud. Let's get into it. The actual strengths of intuitive introverts. The ones nobody claps for at meetings. The ones that don't show up well on resumes. The ones that honestly take years to fully appreciate, even for the person who has them. So here's the point we're addressing now. What does someone like this bring to the table when the world actually stops and listens? First, there's pattern recognition. Not just noticing what's happening, but sensing where it's headed. This is the kind of mind that can listen to half a conversation and already feel the subtext of where it's going, or read between the lines of a team's behavior and catch the storm building before it ever gets loud. Then there's inner clarity, not surface-level confidence, but a knowing that doesn't need to be defended. People like this often make slow decisions, but when they do, they're rarely off the mark. Why? Because they've been turning that idea around in their head long before it looked like they were doing anything. And there's emotional depth, not always flashy or obvious, but strong enough to sit with uncomfortable truths without panicking. That alone makes them valuable in spaces where others are rushing to fix things before they've fully understood them. You don't see these strengths in action unless you know what to look for. And if you're the one carrying them, chances are you've doubted them, because no one taught you that these traits were strengths. In a culture obsessed with speed, output, and charisma, a slow-burning mind looks like a liability, until the moment it isn't. Ever had someone say, "You always seem to notice things no one else does"? That's not a compliment to brush off. That's your intuition doing its work. So here's the takeaway. Stop measuring your worth by how fast you talk or how loud you show up. Some of the most impactful people never lead from the front. They just listen better, read deeper, and move when the timing is right. This part is about integration. about what it means to live as an intuitive introvert in a world that keeps trying to flatten out your edges or speed you up. Because let's be honest, most people who fit this type have at some point tried to contort themselves just to make life easier. You pretend you're more social than you are. Talk over your own discomfort just to keep the room from noticing it, or fake certainty when your mind is still deep in reflection. But it always costs something: energy, clarity, sometimes even self-trust. So here's the core question. How do you move through this noisy world without diluting the way your mind works? First, you stop apologizing for it. That's not some pep talk line. It's a hard shift. Because people pick up on the energy of someone who feels like they have to shrink in order to be acceptable. It trains others to ignore the quiet signal you're sending, and honestly, it trains you to doubt your own sense of things. Second, know when to engage and when to pull back. Not all silence is avoidance. Sometimes it's a boundary. It's you saying, I need to sit with this before I speak on it. And if people can't respect that pace, they're not seeing you. They're seeing what they want you to be. Last, trust that you don't need to explain everything. Not every insight needs to be spoken. Not every emotion needs to be translated into words just to prove it's real. The best moments often happen when someone senses that you understand, even if you never say it out loud. This kind of living takes practice. You'll misstep. You'll over-explain one day and ghost the next. You'll wish you were someone who could just roll with the noise. But over time, you'll see the people who actually get you don't need the noise. The point here is that you can be fully yourself, quiet, deep-thinking, intuitive, and still be heard. You don't need to swap it out for something louder or flashier. After everything, after talking about the inner complexity, the constant tension between solitude and connection, the intuitive insights that can feel like both a gift and a burden, what was Jung really trying to say about people like this? It wasn't just analysis. Jung wasn't interested in boxing people in. His view of the intuitive introvert was never about creating a category to hide behind. He was looking for the soul beneath the personality. He believed these individuals were bridges between the unconscious and the conscious, the inner world and the outer world. Not because they asked to be, but because their nature positioned them that way. And in a world obsessed with certainty and speed, Jung saw the value in someone who pauses, reflects, and questions the deeper meaning of things most people ignore. He once said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." That's what this whole conversation has really been about. Awakening, not in a spiritual marketing sense, but in a raw, grounded way. The kind that happens when you stop measuring your mind by other people's standards and start honoring the way you process the world. If you recognize yourself in this description, you don't need fixing. You need space. Space to think the way you do, to make sense of things before reacting, to trust the patterns you see, even if others miss them. This isn't about claiming superiority. It's about recognizing the quiet intelligence that exists in being wired differently and learning how to live with it instead of against it. So if you've ever felt too sensitive, too reflective, too much in your head, maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just built for a kind of perception the world doesn't always reward, but desperately needs. And that's worth holding on to. Let the world catch up. If you've made it this far, chances are you've seen yourself reflected somewhere in all of this. Maybe it's the way your mind drifts into patterns others don't see. Maybe it's the hours you've spent turning over the same idea, not out of obsession, but because something in you needed it to feel whole before letting go. Carl Jung didn't write these theories for fun. He was wrestling with what it means to be human. And if you're wired as an intuitive introvert, that wrestle is your reality. You don't live on the surface. You're not skimming life for highlights. You're absorbing it, decoding it, searching for what's beneath the noise. That depth comes with a price. Misunderstandings, isolation, even self-doubt. But it also comes with a certain clarity that can't be bought or borrowed. And if you learn how to own it without apology, you stop trying to be palatable. You stop editing yourself to fit into rooms that were never designed for your kind of mind. So here's the real invitation. Don't shrink to match your surroundings. Expand the space around you instead. Speak when it matters, even if your voice is softer. Trust your perceptions, even if they take longer to form. Build the kind of life that honors what's internal, not just what's loud. And if this spoke to you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that how they move through the world isn't a mistake, it's a different kind of knowing. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, deep, human, honest. Stories that don't talk down to you or dress things up just to impress. And if there's something you've been sitting with, something you've never had words for but always felt, leave it in the comments. Let it out. Because people like you don't just think deeply, you help the rest of us see clearly. That's where the real power is.